The spring of 1838 arrived late in Virginia's Piedmont region, winter lingering stubbornly into April and delaying the planting season on estates that had struggled through years of declining agricultural productivity and mounting economic anxiety. In the slave quarters of Hillcrest Plantation, nestled in the rolling landscape between Charlottesville and Lynchburg, household servants spoke in careful whispers about an extraordinary purchase that had just been completed. A man so tall he made the tallest among them look like children, acquired not by the master for practical purposes, but at the explicit insistence of the mistress for reasons no one quite understood. According to local legend, this wasn't simply another transaction in the endless commerce of human flesh that sustained Virginia's economy as it transformed from agricultural empire to breeding ground for the domestic slave trade. This was a purchase that would expose the particular dynamics of power within slaveholding households, revealing how white women's desires and anxieties could shape enslavement in ways as cruel and capricious as anything their husbands imposed. Fragmentary records suggest that what unfolded over the next 2 years would become a story whispered across the Upper South, a tale of how vanity, social competition among plantation mistresses, and the peculiar psychology of domestic slavery could combine to create circumstances where visibility itself became both weapon and prison, where someone acquired as a status symbol would transform into a challenge that exposed every contradiction in the refined household operations that Virginia's slaveholding women prided themselves on maintaining. Virginia's Piedmont region in the late 1830s represented a landscape in economic and social transition, caught between its origins as prosperous tobacco country and an uncertain future as agricultural yields declined and population flowed westward toward more fertile lands. The soil that had once generated substantial wealth had been exhausted through generations of intensive cultivation, forcing planters to shift to wheat and mixed agriculture that produced less revenue while requiring comparable labor investments. This economic pressure had accelerated Virginia's transformation into the primary source of enslaved labor for the domestic slave trade, with Piedmont counties experiencing particularly high rates of forced migration as planters sold people south and west to service debts or finance consumption that agricultural revenues could no longer support. Charlottesville had become a regional center for this human commerce, with slave markets operating near the university that Thomas Jefferson had founded, their transactions generating revenue that helped fund the town's economy while creating scenes of families torn apart within view of institutions supposedly dedicated to enlightenment and human advancement. The society that maintained this system operated through mechanisms that distinguished Virginia slavery from the brutal cotton plantations of the Deep South, with greater emphasis on household service, skilled trades, and urban occupations that supposedly demonstrated the institution's civilized character. Piedmont planters, particularly those from families with colonial-era pedigrees, prided themselves on refined household management that they claimed elevated slavery above mere economic exploitation into something approaching familial relationships, a self-serving fiction that obscured the reality of absolute power exercised over people who could be sold at any moment. White women in these households occupied complicated positions within slavery's power dynamics, simultaneously wielding significant authority over enslaved domestic workers while remaining legally and socially subordinate to their husbands, channeling their own frustrations and limited agency into management of household operations and competition with other plantation mistresses over the quality and training of their servants. The legal structures governing Virginia slavery in 1838 reflected 2 centuries of legislative refinement, creating one of the most comprehensive slave codes in American history. Enslaved people were defined as chattel property, subject to their owners' absolute control, yet also recognized as persons for purposes of criminal prosecution and certain regulatory requirements that attempted to maintain social order while preserving slaveholder authority. The code forbade enslaved people from learning to read, from gathering without white supervision, from traveling without written passes, from testifying against white people in legal proceedings, a comprehensive apparatus of control that attempted to prevent any form of autonomous organization or resistance. Free black people existed in the Piedmont in significant numbers, perhaps 5,000 by 1840, but under crushing restrictions that required registration, prohibited certain occupations, and subjected them to constant surveillance by patrols authorized to question anyone appearing to be of African descent about their legal status and right to move freely. Into this world of codified oppression disguised as paternalistic refinement came someone who would demonstrate that household slavery's elaborate hierarchies and claims of civilized management could be as arbitrary and destructive as any field operations brutality, that white women's exercise of power over enslaved people they claim to care for could be as capricious and cruel as anything their husbands imposed. The contradiction was inherent in domestic slavery's structure. White women who lacked legal independence or full property rights under Virginia law nevertheless wielded near absolute authority over enslaved household workers, projecting their own frustrations with subordinate status onto people they could control completely, using management of household servants as an arena where they could exercise power denied to them in other aspects of their lives. Stories passed down through generations claim that Sephu arrived at Hillcrest Plantation in March 1838, purchased at a Charlottesville slave market not because the plantation owner needed his labor, but because his wife had demanded his acquisition after seeing him displayed at auction. The circumstances of this purchase would become central to understanding everything that followed, revealing dynamics that official records rarely captured, but that shaped enslaved people's experiences in profound ways. According to oral histories, Eleanor Hampton had attended the slave market that day, accompanying her husband Robert on what should have been a routine trip to purchase additional field workers to replace those recently sold south to satisfy creditors. But when the auctioneer brought Sephu to the block, standing 7 feet and 7 inches tall, with a physique that suggested both tremendous strength and remarkable physical grace, Mrs. Hampton had insisted immediately that her husband purchase him regardless of price, overriding Robert's protests about the expense and his lack of need for someone with Sephu's particular qualities. The bidding that followed became something of a spectacle in Charlottesville, with Robert Hampton competing against several other buyers at his wife's relentless insistence until he finally secured Sephu for an astronomical sum, $2,300, nearly triple what prime field hands typically cost and more than the Hampton family could comfortably afford given their deteriorating financial situation. Oral histories preserved multiple explanations for Eleanor Hampton's determination to acquire Sephu, despite the irrational economics of the purchase. Some accounts suggested pure vanity. She wanted to own the most extraordinary enslaved person available as proof of Hillcrest's continued prosperity and her own status among Piedmont plantation mistresses. Others hinted at more complex motivations rooted in the social competition that consumed Virginia's slaveholding women, suggesting that a rival mistress at a neighboring plantation had recently acquired an unusually tall footman, and that Eleanor Hampton refused to be outdone in the endless contest over household magnificence that these women waged through their servants. A few whispered versions of the story suggested even darker psychological dimensions, hinting that Eleanor Hampton's insistence reflected her own troubled marriage and her desire to possess someone whose physical extraordinariness would give her a kind of power and control she lacked in other aspects of her life. Whatever the true motivations, what seemed clear from all accounts was that Sephu was purchased not for any rational economic purpose, but to satisfy the mistress's desires in ways that had nothing to do with plantation productivity, and everything to do with the peculiar psychology of power, status, and control that characterized domestic slavery's operations. Robert Hampton purchased Sephu with obvious reluctance and growing resentment about being pressured into an acquisition that made no economic sense. But his wife's social standing and his own desire to avoid public conflict between spouses meant he completed the transaction despite his better judgment. What neither Eleanor nor Robert Hampton anticipated, what their different forms of arrogance prevented them from recognizing, was that they had purchased someone whose extraordinary physical presence would make traditional household service impossible to manage, according to the scripts that Virginia's plantation mistresses had developed over generations. Sephu's height meant he couldn't be deployed in the ways Eleanor Hampton had envisioned, couldn't serve as a footman or butler whose presence would impress visitors without also disrupting the careful aesthetics and social arrangements that made such displays effective. His size dominated any space he occupied so completely that rather than enhancing household elegance, his presence created jarring contrasts that made refined entertaining impossible. The rhythm of life at Hillcrest Plantation followed patterns established through decades of Piedmont operations. Elaborate routines that distinguished between field workers who labored in declining wheat cultivation and the extensive household staff who maintained the main residence under Eleanor Hampton's direct and notoriously demanding supervision. The main house, a federal-style mansion built in the 1790s when Virginia's Piedmont still generated substantial agricultural wealth, required constant maintenance and operated according to hierarchies as complex as any aristocratic household. Eleanor Hampton managed this domestic empire with obsessive attention to detail and a reputation for harsh treatment of servants who failed to meet her exacting standards, using household service as the primary arena where she could exercise the kind of authority that her position as a married woman denied her in legal and commercial matters. Sephu worked in this environment from his first day at Hillcrest, initially assigned to duties that Eleanor Hampton believed would showcase his extraordinary height: standing attendance at formal dinners, greeting visitors at the main entrance, performing tasks that would make his size visible to the guests whose admiration she craved. But scattered documents hint that from the very beginning, these assignments created complications that neither Hampton understood or knew how to resolve. Sephu's presence didn't enhance social occasions, it dominated and disrupted them in ways that defeated the entire purpose of his acquisition. When he stood at the dining room entrance during formal dinners, his massive frame didn't fade into elegant background as good footmen were supposed to do. Instead, he drew constant attention, making conversation difficult as guests found themselves distracted by his extraordinary size, their eyes repeatedly drawn to him rather than focusing on the social interactions and displays of refined taste that such gatherings were designed to facilitate. Local tradition holds that the first serious crisis occurred within weeks of Sephu's arrival, during what should have been Eleanor Hampton's triumphant display of her new acquisition at a formal dinner party, hosting several neighboring plantation families. She had positioned Sephu prominently, intending his presence to demonstrate Hillcrest's continued ability to afford the most extraordinary servants and to establish her superiority in the endless social competition among Piedmont mistresses. But the evening proved disastrous in ways that exposed the fundamental miscalculation underlying his purchase. Guests found Sephu's presence so unsettling that the careful social choreography Eleanor Hampton had planned fell apart completely. Conversations faltered as people found themselves unable to ignore someone whose head nearly touched the ceiling, whose physical presence seemed almost threatening despite his careful attempts to remain still and unobtrusive. Some guests expressed open discomfort, making comments about the inappropriateness of employing someone so physically imposing in domestic service, suggesting that Eleanor Hampton's judgment was questionable and that perhaps such an acquisition was more vulgar display than refined taste. What happened after the guests departed, according to oral histories that were repeated and remembered across generations, revealed the particular cruelty that domestic slavery enabled when white women channeled their own frustrations and humiliations into treatment of people they controlled absolutely. Eleanor Hampton, enraged by the social failure and the implicit criticism of her judgment, blamed Sephu entirely for the evening's disaster. She ordered him brought to the main house's rear service area and had him whipped severely by Robert Hampton's overseer. Punishment administered not for any specific failure, but because his very existence had failed to produce the social triumph she had anticipated. The beating was savage enough to leave Sephu barely able to stand, brutal enough that other household servants who witnessed it spoke about it in hushed tones for weeks afterward. But the physical violence was perhaps less devastating than the psychological message it conveyed. Sephu had been purchased not as a laborer whose productivity mattered, but as an ornament whose only value lay in enhancing his owner's status. And when he failed in that role through no fault of his own, he was punished with a savagery that revealed just how capricious and cruel power exercised by frustrated white women could be. The spring and summer of 1838 brought escalating tensions at Hillcrest, as Eleanor Hampton struggled to find any use for Sephu that would justify his enormous purchase price, while also satisfying her need to extract some return on an acquisition that had become a source of embarrassment rather than status. She attempted various household roles, assigning him to tasks that ranged from maintenance work to service positions, but none proved workable within the constraints his extraordinary height imposed. When assigned to visible domestic service, he disrupted rather than enhanced household operations through the attention his presence inevitably drew. When assigned to maintenance work out of public view, his deployment represented an admission that the purchase had been a mistake, that $2,300 had been spent on someone who couldn't perform the roles he'd been acquired for. Whispered tales speak of Eleanor Hampton's treatment of Sephu during this period as reflecting the worst aspects of domestic slavery's psychology, the ways that white women's exercise of power over household servants could become vehicles for expressing their own rage and frustration with limited agency in other aspects of their lives. She began finding fault with everything he did, inventing infractions that justified punishments administered to satisfy her need to assert control over someone whose very existence reminded her of her own poor judgment. She would order him to perform impossible tasks, reaching heights that even his extraordinary stature couldn't access, moving objects too heavy for any human to manage alone, and then have him punished when he failed to accomplish what she had demanded. Other household servants watched these interactions with growing horror, recognizing that Sephu was being destroyed not for any actual inadequacy, but because his presence had become intolerable to a mistress who couldn't admit her mistake and who possessed absolute power to make her frustrations his problem. By fall of 1838, fragmentary records suggest that the situation at Hillcrest had deteriorated to crisis levels that threatened the plantation's operations and the Hampton family's already precarious social standing. Robert Hampton, who had opposed the purchase from the beginning, now faced mounting criticism from other Piedmont planters about his inability to control his wife's household management and her wasteful acquisition of an enslaved person who served no useful purpose. His financial position had worsened significantly, partly because of Sephu's purchase price, but also due to broader economic pressures affecting Virginia agriculture, and creditors were beginning to make pointed inquiries about his ability to service debts. Eleanor Hampton, meanwhile, had become increasingly isolated from other plantation mistresses who viewed her treatment of Sephu as evidence of poor judgment and questioned whether someone who managed household servants so badly deserved the social standing she claimed. Local tradition holds that matters came to a head in November 1838, during an incident that would become legendary among enslaved communities throughout the Piedmont, and that would haunt the Hampton family for years afterward. According to these accounts, Eleanor Hampton ordered Sephu to stand in the main hallway for an entire day without moving, purely as punishment for some trivial perceived inadequacy, intending his forced stillness to demonstrate her absolute power over even someone whose size might suggest capacity for resistance. But standing motionless for hours proved impossible, even for someone of Sephu's extraordinary strength. Eventually, his legs buckled and he collapsed, unable to maintain the position she had demanded. When Eleanor Hampton discovered him on the floor, oral histories claim she flew into a rage and ordered immediate punishment that exceeded anything previous, demanding that Robert Hampton personally whip Sephu in front of assembled household servants to demonstrate that no amount of physical size protected anyone from consequences of disobedience. What happened next exposed tensions that had been building in the Hampton household since Sephu's arrival, conflicts that went far beyond a single enslaved person situation to reveal broader dynamics of power, gender, and control within slaveholding families. Robert Hampton reportedly refused his wife's demand, telling her that he had opposed purchasing Sephu from the beginning, that her insistence had created an untenable situation, and that he would not destroy valuable property to satisfy her need to prove authority she had already demonstrated through months of irrational cruelty. This refusal, delivered in the presence of household servants who would remember and repeat his words, represented an extraordinary breakdown in the united front that slaveholding couples were supposed to present before enslaved people they claimed to own. Eleanor Hampton's response, according to multiple oral accounts, was to demand that if her husband wouldn't administer punishment she deemed necessary, she would find someone who would, threatening to have the overseer carry out the whipping regardless of Robert's objections. The confrontation escalated in ways that made clear just how dysfunctional the Hampton household had become, how much Sephu's presence had exposed conflicts that predated his arrival, but that his extraordinary nature had made impossible to continue ignoring. Robert Hampton, facing both his wife's rage and the economic reality that Sephu represented a massive investment that further violence might permanently damage, made a decision that resolved the immediate crisis while revealing the fundamental emptiness of slaveholding claims about paternalistic care. He announced that Sephu would be sold immediately, that he would take whatever price was available to eliminate the problem his wife's insistence had created, that the entire disastrous acquisition needed to end before it destroyed what remained of the family's finances and social standing. The consequences of this decision rippled through Hillcrest and beyond in ways that illuminated the particular vulnerabilities enslaved people faced when white women's desires and frustrations shaped their fates. For Sephu, the announcement meant facing sale into unknown circumstances, almost certainly to the Deep South where his size would make him valuable for the most brutal labor in cotton or sugar production. The irony was devastating. He had been purchased to satisfy a white woman's vanity and social ambitions, had endured months of irrational cruelty because his very existence reminded her of poor judgment, and now would be sold away, not because he had done anything wrong, but because his presence had become intolerable to those who claimed to own him. For other household servants at Hillcrest, the incident confirmed what they had long understood about domestic slavery's particular cruelties, that proximity to white families meant exposure to their psychological pathologies and interpersonal conflicts, that being valued primarily as status symbols rather than productive laborers made enslaved people vulnerable to capricious treatment that had nothing to do with their own actions or worth. By December 1838, scattered documents hint that Robert Hampton had sold Sephu to a slave trader for significantly less than the purchase price, taking a financial loss that damaged the family's already precarious economic position, but eliminating the immediate source of household conflict. What happened to Sephu after this sale remains largely unknown, swallowed by the deliberate gaps in historical records that characterize the domestic slave trade's operations. Some oral histories claim he was sold to a cotton plantation in Alabama, where his extraordinary strength would be exploited until his body broke under labor, designed to extract maximum short-term productivity, regardless of long-term consequences. Others suggest he was purchased by a Richmond merchant who employed him in commercial operations where his size remained valuable, but where the dynamics differed from the psychologically destructive household service he had endured at Hillcrest. A few accounts even claim that Sephu escaped during transport to his new owner, using his intelligence and perhaps assistance from others to flee toward free territory, despite the enormous challenges his distinctive appearance posed for remaining undetected. The truth, whatever it was, disappeared into the systematic erasure that characterized enslaved people's experiences in historical records, controlled by those who benefited from slavery's continuation. What seems certain is that his time at Hillcrest left permanent scars, physical marks from months of punishments administered to satisfy Eleanor Hampton's psychological needs, but also deeper wounds from experiencing the particular cruelty of being purchased as an ornament and then destroyed when he failed to satisfy purposes he had never been consulted about and could never control. The impact of Sephu's story persisted long after his departure from Hillcrest, creating conversations that revealed anxieties about domestic slavery's operations and the particular power white women wielded over household servants. For enslaved communities throughout the Piedmont, the tale became evidence of how vulnerable people were to white women's whims and frustrations, how vanity and social competition among plantation mistresses could determine fates with as much cruelty as anything male slaveholders imposed. Workers on other plantations whispered about the giant who had been purchased at a wife's insistence and then destroyed when he couldn't satisfy expectations he had no role in creating. Using his story as a warning about the dangers of being too extraordinary or too visible, about how sometimes survival required being unremarkable enough to avoid becoming a symbol in white people's psychological dramas. For white society in the Piedmont, particularly among plantation mistresses who heard the story, reactions varied significantly based on their own relationships to household slavery and their psychological investments in its operations. Some expressed criticism of Eleanor Hampton's judgment and treatment of Sephu, using the incident to establish their own superior household management skills and more refined approaches to domestic service. Others defended her implicitly, recognizing that admitting the cruelty of her actions would require acknowledging uncomfortable truths about the power all plantation mistresses wielded, and the psychological purposes that household slavery served beyond mere domestic convenience. A few, in private conversations unlikely to be recorded, even admitted that perhaps Eleanor Hampton had simply been more honest about what household slavery actually was, not paternalistic care, but absolute power exercised over people who existed primarily to satisfy their owners' needs for status, control, and validation. Robert Hampton's role in the entire episode generated its own conversations among Piedmont planters, revealing tensions about masculine authority and household management that slavery's gender dynamics created. Some praised his eventual decision to sell Sephu and end the crisis, viewing it as prudent management that prioritized family finances over his wife's irrational attachment to an expensive mistake. Others criticized him for allowing the purchase in the first place, suggesting that proper masculine authority meant controlling wives' impulses rather than indulging them at enormous financial and social cost. A few recognized that the incident exposed broader contradictions in how slave-holding households operated. White women wielded significant power over enslaved people while remaining legally subordinate to their husbands, creating situations where their authority could be undermined in ways that damaged household operations and revealed divisions that enslaved people might exploit. The deeper truth that Sephu's story illuminates extends far beyond the specific circumstances of one extraordinary individual purchased to satisfy a white woman's vanity and then destroyed when reality failed to match her expectations. His experience reveals the particular cruelties that domestic slavery enabled when white women channeled their own frustrations with limited agency into treatment of people they controlled absolutely. The contradiction was fundamental. Plantation mistresses lacked legal independence or full property rights under Virginia law, couldn't own property in their own names, couldn't make contracts or control their own finances, yet wielded near absolute authority over enslaved household workers. This combination of subordination in some relationships and dominance in others created psychological pressures that enslaved people bore through treatment that could be as arbitrary and cruel as anything male slaveholders imposed. Sephu's extraordinary height made these dynamics visible in ways that normal-sized household servants' experiences might not have, his very extraordinariness making him impossible to ignore or render invisible in the background as domestic service normally required. He was purchased not for productive labor or even for rational status display, but to satisfy complex psychological needs that Eleanor Hampton herself probably couldn't have fully articulated. Needs for control, for visible proof of continued wealth, for superiority in endless social competition among plantation mistresses, for power that she lacked in other aspects of her life. When he inevitably failed to satisfy these inchoate and contradictory desires, when his presence created social embarrassment rather than triumph, the violence turned against him reflected not just one woman's cruelty, but the broader pathology of a system that gave frustrated, legally subordinate white women absolute power over people whose only crime was existing in ways that didn't serve their owners' psychological needs. Stories passed down through generations preserve knowledge about these particular dynamics of domestic slavery that official documents systematically excluded. Knowledge about how white women's exercise of power over household servants could be as destructive as anything male slaveholders imposed, about how vanity and social competition shaped enslaved people's fates in ways that had nothing to do with their own actions or capabilities. These oral traditions tell us that household service exposed enslaved people not just to violence, but to the psychological pathologies and interpersonal conflicts of white families, that being valued primarily as status symbols made people vulnerable to treatment that rational economic calculation would never justify. They remind us that behind every discussion of domestic slavery's supposedly refined character, every claim about paternalistic care distinguishing household service from field operations brutality, existed realities of capricious cruelty driven by white women's frustrations and psychological needs that enslaved people bore through suffering, that official narratives erased or minimized. The fact that we cannot verify every detail of Sephu's story with documentary precision does not diminish its essential truth or its importance for understanding slavery in all its dimensions. The story carries the weight of lived experience transmitted through communities that understood the particular vulnerabilities household service created, that knew how white women's power over domestic workers could manifest in ways as cruel as anything their husbands imposed. It speaks to the reality that enslaved people were subject not just to economic exploitation, but to the psychological pathologies and social anxieties of those who claimed to own them, that their fates could be determined by factors having nothing to do with their own worth or actions, but everything to do with their owners' needs for control, status, and validation. The fragmentary nature of the historical record itself tells a story about how power works to preserve narratives serving its interests while erasing evidence of the arbitrary cruelty that characterized slavery's operations. Plantation records noted Sephu's purchase and eventual sale, documenting the financial transactions, but revealing nothing about the months of irrational punishment administered to satisfy Eleanor Hampton's psychological needs. Official histories celebrated Virginia's supposedly refined approach to domestic slavery, while systematically excluding stories about how white women's frustrations and vanities shaped household operations in ways that had nothing to do with paternalistic care and everything to do with absolute power exercised over vulnerable people. The legacy of Sephu and others like him resonates across American history, because it reminds us that slavery was never just economic exploitation. It was psychological domination that gave white people, including white women, despite their own legal subordination, power to destroy lives to satisfy needs having nothing to do with productive labor or rational calculation. Every claim about domestic slavery's civilized refinement masked realities of capricious cruelty driven by social competition and frustrated agency. Every assertion of paternalistic care obscured the truth that enslaved people existed primarily to serve their owners' psychological needs for control, status, and validation, rather than to receive care or protection. And sometimes, according to the legends that communities kept alive when official history tried to erase them, that arbitrary cruelty stood 7 feet 7 inches tall, purchased at a white woman's insistence to satisfy vanity and social ambition, destroyed through months of irrational punishment when reality failed to match expectations, sold away at financial loss when continued presence became intolerable. Reminder of poor judgment. Sephu's time at Hillcrest lasted barely more than 8 months, but his story rippled through enslaved communities across generations, creating narratives that preserved knowledge about domestic slavery's particular cruelties, about how white women's power over household servants could be as destructive as anything male slaveholders imposed, about how being extraordinary or too visible could make someone vulnerable to treatment, having nothing to do with their worth or actions, but everything to do with their owner's psychological pathologies. The truth of these stories lies not in their precise factual accuracy, but in the experiences they represent and the knowledge they preserve. Knowledge about how slavery destroyed lives to satisfy white people's needs for control and status. About how domestic service exposed people to cruelties that rational economic logic would never justify. About how human beings were reduced to symbols in white families' psychological dramas, with consequences that could be as devastating as any field operations brutality.